A widow saved a wild stallion. Less than 24 hours later, her ranch was under siege. The gate had not been locked in 11 months. Tonight, it would be. A woman stood alone at the edge of a barbed wire fence at 2 in the morning, blood on her hands that was not her own, staring at a wild animal 3 times her size that could kill her with a single kick. She did not move away. She reached forward instead. Somewhere behind her, in the dark house on the hill, a phone was already ringing, and the man who answered it was smiling. Before the story goes further, sit with that image for a moment, because in less than a day, everything about it will change. A rancher's widow, a wounded stallion, and a loss so old that almost no one in town remembered it existed. If you have ever lost someone and felt the world quietly stop making room for you, you will understand why Marcella went out into that field in the middle of the night. And if you have ever watched someone try to take something from a person who has already lost everything, you will understand what happens next. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to fight for something everyone else had already given up on, let us know. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and stay until the end, because the reason that old fence line mattered was written down almost 100 years before Marcella was born. This is her story. The valley sat quiet under a late September sky, the kind of sky that turned orange and then bruised purple over the Bitterroot foothills before the cold set in for good. Elkhorn Creek Ranch had belonged to the same family for 4 generations, a spread of 900 acres pressed up against federal grazing land, where the last free-roaming horse herds in that part of Montana still moved through the sage like weather systems, unpredictable and untouchable. Marcella Hale had married into that land 9 years ago, and for 7 of those years the porch light had never gone dark before midnight, because Jedediah liked to sit outside with a cup of coffee gone cold and watch the horses on the ridge line, the wild ones, the ones nobody owned. He used to say a ranch without wild horses nearby was just a farm with better scenery. She used to laugh at that. She did not laugh anymore. He had gone into the ground 18 months ago, fast, the way a heart just stops sometimes without asking permission first, on a Tuesday morning while checking irrigation lines, and by the time Marcella found him, the coffee in his mug had already gone cold on its own. There had been no illness to fight, no warning to heed, nothing she could have done, and that absence of blame was somehow the cruelest part of it. A slow death might have given her someone to be angry at. A fast one only gave her a silence that never filled back in. Since then the ranch had narrowed around her the way a held breath narrows a chest. The east pasture fence sagged in 3 places, and she had not called anyone to fix it. The barn roof had a patch of missing shingles that let a strip of daylight fall onto the hay in the mornings, a thin gold blade she had stopped noticing weeks ago. Her nearest neighbor, a woman named Odette who ran cattle 2 miles south, still left a casserole on the porch every few Sundays, and still it sat there sometimes for 2 days before Marcella brought it in, because going to the door meant being seen, and being seen meant being asked how she was doing. And there was no honest answer to that question anymore that fit inside a doorway conversation. The town of Larkspur Hollow, 40 minutes down the county road, had mostly stopped expecting her at church, at the feed store, at the little historical society meetings her husband used to attend out of family obligation. People still spoke of her kindly. People also spoke of the ranch the way you speak of an old dog that everyone loves, but no one wants to feed. It's a shame, they said. Such good land. Somebody ought to help her. One person in particular had been saying that a great deal. Malachi Hale was Jedediah's younger brother, a man who had left Elkhorn Creek at 19 for an accounting job in Bozeman and had spent every visit home since reminding people, gently, almost affectionately, that ranching was a dying way to bleed money slowly. He drove up from town twice that fall in a truck too clean for the roads out here, and both times he found some reason to walk the fence line with his phone held up, framing photographs he did not explain. He called Marcella honey in a voice that had learned somewhere how to sound like concern while meaning something else entirely. He asked about her finances the way a man asks about a wound he is hoping is infected. There was a folder in his truck the second time he visited. Marcella had not seen inside it. She had seen him glance at it before he got out of the vehicle, though the way a man checks a weapon is still in its holster, and something in her had gone very still and very cold. The kind of cold that used to belong to instinct before grief had dulled every other instinct she owned. That was the world Marcella Hale lived inside on the last ordinary night of her old life. A house too large for one person. A ranch too quiet for the work it needed. A brother-in-law circling with a folder full of something he had not yet named. And on the far ridge, just past the boundary fence where the barbed wire met the public land, a herd of wild horses moved like smoke against the dying light. Led by a stallion, the local Bureau of Land Management Contractors had failed twice to gather. A horse so wary of humans that even the wranglers who tried to rope him called him something between a myth and a nuisance behind his back. She had not gone looking for him. That was the part that would matter later, though she did not know it yet. She had only gone out because the dog was barking at something past the tree line and would not stop, a low, urgent, unfamiliar sound that pulled her out of bed and into her boots before she had fully decided to move at all. The wind had teeth in it that night, sharp enough to cut through her coat before she reached the fence, and the moon was thin, more suggestion than light. She followed the sound another 200 yards along the boundary, past the leaning post that Jedediah had always meant to replace, until the shape of something enormous resolved itself out of the dark, thrashing, low to the ground, tangled in a coil of old barbed wire that had come loose from a fence post decades past its purpose. The horse was down on its side in the dirt, one hind leg wrapped tight enough that the wire had bitten through hide and into muscle, and every time it tried to rise, the wire pulled tighter and the animal screamed, a sound Marcella had heard only once before in her life and had hoped never to hear again. Blood had darkened the ground beneath the leg into something black in the moonlight. The horse's eyes rolled white with panic each time it thrashed, and the whole enormous body of it shuddered with the kind of exhaustion that comes right before an animal simply stops fighting and waits to die. She did not call anyone. There was no signal out here worth trusting, and even if there had been, the nearest large animal vet was 90 minutes away and the nearest wildlife officer further than that, and something in the horse's breathing told her 90 minutes might not exist for him. So Marcella climbed through the sagging fence with a flashlight in one hand and nothing else. No rope, no plan, no reason to believe a wild stallion who had spent his entire life avoiding the touch of anything human would allow her close enough to help. He did not, at first. He kicked at the air the moment her light found his face, a warning so violent it threw dirt 6 feet in every direction, and she fell back and sat in the cold grass for a long minute, simply breathing, watching him, letting the only sound between them be the wind moving through the dry stalks of grass on the ridge. Then she began speaking to him, not words meant to explain anything. Low, unhurried sounds, the kind you'd use on a spooked calf or a grieving child. The kind of voice she had not used on anything living since the morning she found her husband on the kitchen floor with a coffee mug still warm at the edges. She did not know where the voice came from. It surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise the horse. It took 40 minutes before he stopped trying to rise every time she moved. It took another hour before he allowed her hand near the wound at all, and even then his whole body remained a held breath, a threat suspended, ready to detonate at the first wrong motion. She worked in near total darkness, her flashlight propped in the dirt, using the wire cutters from her barn toolkit that she'd run back for once, twisting each barb loose one at a time, freeing an inch of torn flesh with every careful pull, murmuring the entire time in that same low, unbroken tone, an anchor thrown into a storm that had no reason to hold. By the time the eastern sky went the color of an old bruise healing, the wire lay in a coiled heap beside her, and the horse's leg was free, wrapped in strips torn from her own coat lining, and the animal stood, unsteady, favoring the leg, but standing, 6 feet from a woman who had not touched another living creature with tenderness in longer than she could remember. She did not try to lead him anywhere. She simply sat back on her heels in the mud and the blood and the gray coming light and watched him breathe. And for the first time in 18 months, something in her own chest loosened enough to let a full breath in and out without catching halfway through. She would call him sovereign before the sun was fully up, not because she meant to keep him, but because a name is what you give something the moment you realize you already care whether it lives. She did not know yet that the wire she had cut belonged to the boundary between private land and public range, or that helping an injured wild horse cross that line, however unintentionally, however far from any human witness, had just triggered a chain of consequence that would reach her front gate before the sun set twice. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, Marcella had made a decision that felt, in the moment, almost too small to matter. She would not push the stallion back through the gap in the fence to fend for himself on public land with an unhealed wound and a leg that could still turn septic in a week. She would bring him onto Elkhorn Creek, into the empty round pen behind the barn that Jedediah had built the year they married, and that had stood unused since the last of their own horses had been sold off during the hardest months after the funeral. When feed bills had felt like an insult she could no longer afford to pay. Getting him there took nearly 2 hours of patience that stretched every nerve in her body thin. She did not rope him. She did not force him. She simply walked, slow and sideways, murmuring, letting him choose each step, and somewhere in that walk something passed between them that had no name yet but felt, to anyone who might have been watching, like the oldest agreement in the world. I will not hurt you if you do not hurt me. The gate to the round pen closed behind him just past 8 in the morning. Marcella stood outside the rails for a long while afterward, arms folded over the ruined coat, watching the stallion circle twice, test the fence with his nose, and finally lower his head to the water trough she'd filled before dawn. Steam rose off her own skin in the cold. She had not slept. She did not feel tired. She felt, instead, something closer to the sensation of coming up for air after a very long time underwater, gasping, disoriented, alive in a way that stung. She went inside only to clean the wound properly, mixing an antiseptic salve from the supplies still stocked in the tack room, tools untouched since Jedediah's hands had last used them. She found herself talking to the horse as she worked, the same low, unbroken register from the night before, and somewhere inside that ritual of care, she noticed she had said more words in the last 3 hours than she had said aloud to another living creature in the previous 3 months combined. It was nearly noon, the stallion resting in the shade of the pen with his injured leg cocked, when Odette's truck rattled up the gravel drive, sent, as it turned out, by 3 separate neighbors who had all spotted an enormous shape moving along Marcella's fence line before sunrise, and had spent the morning trading calls trying to decide whether to believe what they thought they'd seen. Odette climbed out slower than usual, boots crunching gravel, and stood at the pen rail beside Marcella without speaking for a long moment, studying the animal the way a person studies a photograph they can't quite place. Then her hand went still on the top rail. Her eyes moved to the stallion's chest, to a marking beneath the matted hair just above the left foreleg, a pale whorl shaped almost like a crescent split down its center, faint but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. She asked, quiet, careful, whether Marcella knew what she'd brought home. Marcella said only that she knew what she'd found hurt, and what she'd done about it. Odette did not explain further that day. She only said, before she left, that Marcella might want to think twice about keeping that particular animal on private ground, and that she should maybe call somebody official before somebody official called her instead. She said it the way you say something you already suspect is too late to matter, and then she got back in her truck and drove away faster than she'd arrived, leaving Marcella standing at the rail with a question she did not yet have the shape of, watching a wild horse breathe steadily in the autumn sun, unaware that 30 miles away, in an office with better lighting than her entire barn, a phone was already being dialed. Malachi had learned about the stallion before noon, the way certain kinds of men always seem to learn things before anyone else does, through a cousin who worked dispatch for the county and a habit of checking in on his brother's widow with a frequency that had never once, not once, been about concern for her well-being. He drove out to the county annex building instead of the ranch, and by 1 in the afternoon, he was sitting across a metal desk from a zoning officer named Greaves, a folder open between them that was not the same folder he'd carried on his last visit to Elkhorn Creek, though it was every bit as thick. He spoke in the careful, regretful tone of a man forced by conscience into an unpleasant duty. He mentioned his brother's death. He mentioned Marcella's isolation, her declining fences, her missed community obligations, the visible neglect any concerned family member could no longer in good faith ignore. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had apparently taken in a wild, uninspected animal of considerable size and unknown temperament onto a property already flagged, in his words, for a documented pattern of deterioration. He did not mention the mining consortium that had approached him 11 months earlier with an offer for mineral rights across the whole valley basin, an offer contingent on consolidated ownership, an offer that made a 900-acre ranch worth roughly 4 times as much to a man willing to acquire it cheap and sign it over quickly as it was worth to a grieving woman trying to keep her husband's name on a mailbox. Greaves listened, nodded at the appropriate intervals, and reached for a form that existed for exactly these situations: an emergency welfare and safety review. The kind of review that could be triggered by a single credible complaint under an ordinance most residents of Larkspur Hollow had never heard read aloud in their lives. Buried in county code since a time when wandering livestock and unregulated predator control had been common enough problems to legislate. The wording was old. The wording was vague enough to apply almost anywhere the county wanted it to apply. And once triggered, the review authorized immediate access restrictions to the property in question until an assessment could be completed, restrictions enforceable by the sheriff's office on request. Malachi signed where indicated. He thanked Greaves for his time. He drove home past the turnoff to Elkhorn Creek without slowing down, and if anyone had been watching his face in that moment, they might have noticed something close to satisfaction settle into it. The particular ease of a man who has just watched a very long plan click into its next necessary position. By 4 that afternoon, 3 vehicles were already parked along the county road outside Marcella's front gate, though she would not learn what they meant or how fast the ground beneath her had shifted until the knock came at her door less than 20 hours after she'd first knelt in the dark beside a bleeding, terrified horse and decided, for reasons she still could not fully name, that she was not going to let it die alone. Marcella did not sleep that second night either, though not from choice. She had spent the afternoon reinforcing the round pen rails with scrap lumber from the barn, checking the stallion's wound twice more, watching him grow steadier on the leg with each passing hour, and it was near dusk when she noticed the trucks. They had not come to the door. They had simply arrived, parked along the shoulder of the county road on both sides of her cattle guard, engines off, headlights aimed toward the house like something waiting to be noticed. 2 were county vehicles marked with seals she didn't recognize at that distance. 1 was unmarked. A 4th arrived just after dark, towing an empty stock trailer. And that was the one that made something in her stomach fold in on itself, because she understood, without needing to be told, exactly what an empty trailer parked outside a ranch at night was there to carry away. No one approached that first evening. That was, she would come to understand, its own kind of pressure, a wordless demonstration that they could wait exactly as long as it took, that the waiting itself was part of the enforcement, a slow tightening designed to make the knock, when it finally came, feel almost like relief. It came at 7 the next morning. A man in a county uniform stood at her door with a clipboard and an expression carefully arranged into professional neutrality, and behind him, at the gate, 2 more vehicles had joined the others, along with a woman holding a phone up, filming, from a local animal welfare channel that mostly covered lost pet postings and the occasional livestock auction. The man introduced himself as an animal control officer acting under an emergency welfare order. He said the property had been flagged for review following a credible report concerning an unpermitted wild animal, health and safety indicators consistent with neglect, and an owner competency concern. He said, not unkindly, that until the review was completed, the property would be restricted, that she was not to remove the animal from the premises, that feed deliveries would be suspended pending inspection, and that she would need to submit to a competency and welfare interview before any of it could be resolved. He did not say who had filed the report. Marcella did not need him to. She asked how long the review would take. He said reviews of this nature typically resolved within 5 to 7 business days, though the fines for non-compliance accrued daily starting immediately. A figure he read off the clipboard that made the blood leave her face, an amount that would strip the ranch's entire remaining operating account before the week was even finished, an amount clearly designed by someone who understood exactly how thin her margins had become, because only someone with access to that information could have set a number so precisely calibrated to break her. Behind him, at the gate, the empty stock trailer sat waiting in the morning light like a held threat, and somewhere behind her, in the round pen, Sovereign paced the fence line at the sound of unfamiliar engines, ears pinned, the wound on his leg forgotten in favor of a fear that had nothing to do with barbed wire and everything to do with the particular sound humans make when they arrive somewhere in numbers. Marcella stood in her own doorway and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the walls of Elkhorn Creek Ranch, walls her husband's family had held for 4 generations, had just become a cage she was locked inside of, and that the only thing standing between that cage and total collapse was a decision no one else could make for her. She closed the door. She did not sign anything. And somewhere behind the barn, a wild stallion who had learned, in less than a day, to trust the sound of her voice, watched the strangers gather at the fence line with the wary stillness of something that had survived worse sieges than this one, waiting only to see what she would do next. The days that followed compressed themselves into something without clear edges, morning bleeding into afternoon bleeding into another sleepless night, marked only by the slow accumulation of official paperwork stacking on her kitchen table and the steady tightening of the noose Malachi had set in motion. By the second day, the county had suspended the ranch's standing feed delivery account, citing pending review status, which meant the grain order Marcella had placed 3 weeks earlier sat undelivered at the co-op 40 minutes away while her existing stores dwindled. By the third day, a letter arrived by certified mail, forwarded through an attorney's office in Bozeman that Marcella did not recognize, but that, when she finally thought to check, shared an address with the accounting firm Malachi had worked for since leaving the ranch. The letter proposed, in careful legal language, an amicable resolution. Marcella would surrender both the wild animal to county custody and a limited power of attorney over the ranch's operating decisions to a family member better positioned to manage the ongoing review, in exchange for the county's agreement to waive accrued fines and expedite closure of the welfare case. The family member was not named. It did not need to be. She refused to sign. She told the officer at the gate the same thing on the 4th day, and the 5th. Each refusal met with the same patient, procedural courtesy that somehow felt more threatening than open hostility would have, because courtesy this precise required no raised voice to make its meaning clear. This could go on as long as they wanted it to. She could not. The water pump at the boundary line, shared for decades under an informal agreement with the neighboring property, stopped working on the 6th day. Marcella found the breaker box at the property line had been switched off, not damaged, simply switched, and when she asked Odette about it over the fence, her neighbor would not meet her eyes, said only that some of the folks on the review committee had asked around about the arrangement and thought it best, for now, to keep things separate, an answer that told Marcella everything about who else in the valley had quietly decided which side of this fight was safer to stand on. That left her carrying water by hand from the house well to the round pen twice daily, 5-gallon buckets across 300 yards of dry pasture, past the parked trucks and their idling occupants who watched her make the trip without ever once offering to help or ever once looking away, an audience to her exhaustion that felt, by the 8th day, less like observation and more like a slow-motion form of violence, the kind that leaves no bruises and yet somehow leaves everything bruised. Sovereign's leg healed steadily through all of it, the wound closing clean under the salve, and the daily attention Marcella refused to abandon even as her own hands blistered and her own sleep collapsed to 2 or 3 broken hours a night. He had stopped flinching at her approach by the 4th day. By the 7th, he had begun meeting her at the rail each morning before she'd even called out. Ears forward, head low, a gesture so unlike the animal that had nearly kicked her skull in on their first encounter that even the officers watching from their trucks had begun to notice, had begun, in low voices among themselves, to use words like unusual and almost tame, though none of them said it loud enough for it to become part of the official record. On the 9th day, carrying the second of 2 buckets across the pasture at dusk, her arms shaking, her palms split and raw, Marcella stumbled on a rut in the dry ground and went down hard, both buckets emptying into the dirt, and for one long moment, she simply lay there in the fading light, not from injury, but from something closer to defeat finally catching up to a body that had been outrunning it for over a week. She heard the fence rail creak before she heard anything else. Sovereign had pressed his weight against the round pen gate, testing it, and when it held, he pressed again, harder, until the latch Marcella had reinforced with scrap lumber gave way and the gate swung open into the pasture. She expected him to run. Wild horses run. That is the entire architecture of what they are. Instead, he crossed the open ground to where she lay, slow, deliberate, and lowered his head until his breath moved warm across her shoulder, and stood there, simply stood there, an enormous animal holding still beside a broken woman in the dirt, while a row of county trucks watched from the road with their engines running, and no one, for the first time in 9 days, said a single word. She did not know, in that moment, that a video of exactly this was already being filmed on a cracked phone screen from inside one of those parked vehicles. Footage that would matter more than anyone standing in that pasture could have guessed. Footage that would find its way, within 48 hours, to an old man in a wheelchair on the far side of Larkspur Hollow who had not left his house in nearly a year, but who kept, out of habit more than expectation, a subscription to the local animal welfare channel's live broadcasts, and who would sit forward so sharply in his chair when the stallion's chest came into frame that his daughter would ask, alarmed, if he was all right. He would not answer her at first. He would only reach for the remote, rewind the footage, and stare at the pale crescent marking above the horse's foreleg with the recognition of a man looking at something he had been told, decades ago, to watch for, and had never once, in all that time, expected to actually see. By the 10th day, the county had scheduled the formal welfare hearing, not in a courtroom, but at the gate itself, a decision made, ostensibly, for practical reasons involving the animal in question, and, less officially, because a public hearing held in plain sight along the county road drew exactly the kind of crowd Malachi's allies on the local business council wanted watching. An audience assembled to witness what they expected to be a quiet, procedural collapse. Marcella stood at the inside of her own gate that morning in clothes that no longer fit the way they used to, her face drawn thin by 2 weeks without proper sleep, and watched the crowd gather on the far side of the cattle guard. A folding table had been set up in the gravel turnout. 3 members of the county review committee sat behind it, including Greaves, along with a representative from the state's brand inspection office, and, seated slightly apart from the others in a manner that made his role deliberately ambiguous, Malachi, dressed for the occasion in a jacket too clean for a working ranch, his expression arranged into the careful sorrow of a man forced to witness a tragedy he had done everything in his power to prevent. Odette stood further back in the crowd, arms folded, unwilling to meet Marcella's eyes, though her presence there at all, rather than staying home, suggested something in her had not fully settled into the role the review committee had assigned her. A handful of other neighbors stood scattered among the onlookers, some out of genuine concern, most out of the particular curiosity small towns reserve for the public unraveling of one of their own. The hearing opened with a recitation of the complaint, read aloud by Greaves in a flat, administrative tone. Documented neglect of ranch infrastructure, financial insolvency indicators, unauthorized harboring of an unpermitted wild animal exhibiting behavior inconsistent with domesticated handling, and a pattern of owner noncompliance with review procedures suggesting diminished capacity to safely manage the property. He read it the way a man reads something he has read many times before, without weight, without doubt, as though the outcome had been decided before the meeting had even been called to order. Malachi was invited to speak next, framed by the committee as a concerned family member rather than the complainant, a distinction that allowed him to stand at the table with his hands folded and his voice pitched low with what sounded, to anyone who did not know him, like genuine grief. He spoke of his brother. He spoke of watching Marcella disappear into her own house over the past year and a half, of trying, gently, repeatedly, to offer help she had refused, of finally reaching a point where love required intervention rather than patience. He gestured, once, toward the round pin visible in the distance, where Sovereign stood watching the gathered crowd with pinned ears and a stillness that read, to the committee, as exactly the kind of unpredictable temperament that justified everything he was describing. He asked the committee to consider what kind of woman brings an unbroken wild stallion onto a failing property with no facilities, no permits, and no plan beyond. In his words, some kind of grief-driven fantasy about saving something because she could not save her husband. The words landed exactly where he intended them to land. Marcella felt them land. She did not answer immediately, because there was nothing in that moment she trusted her voice to say without breaking, and in the silence that followed, Greaves began reading the recommended resolution: immediate surrender of the animal to county custody for evaluation, and a 90-day conservatorship review of the property's management, effective upon signature. It was, everyone in that crowd understood, the polite legal language for exactly what Malachi had wanted from the beginning, dressed up as concern, arriving with the full weight of the county behind it. Time to close before Marcella had the strength left to fight it any further. The paper was placed on the table in front of the gate, a pin set beside it, and for a long moment the only sound in the gravel turnout was the wind moving through the dry grass and the distant, restless shifting of a wild horse who seemed, even from that distance, to understand exactly what was being decided about him. Marcella stood at the gate with the paper in front of her and did not move to pick up the pen, and in the silence that followed, something in her began to surface that had been buried since the morning she found Jedediah on the kitchen floor, something that had nothing to do with the fear that had governed every decision she'd made since, and everything to do with a question she had never let herself ask out loud until that exact moment. What, precisely, was she actually protecting by giving in? If she signed, the review would close within days. The fines would stop. The trucks would leave. Sovereign would be loaded into that waiting stock trailer, evaluated by county contractors whose evaluation, everyone quietly understood, was a formality preceding transfer to a private buyer already lined up through channels Malachi had spent weeks arranging, a buyer who ran what was euphemistically called a livestock disposition service, the kind of operation that existed specifically to remove unwanted or unmanageable animals from public concern with no questions asked afterward about where they ended up. Her home would remain hers in name only, folded under a 90-day conservatorship that everyone at that table knew would quietly extend itself into something permanent, the way temporary arrangements involving desperate people so often did. If she refused, the fines would continue accruing at a pace that would consume the ranch's remaining accounts within the week. The isolation would deepen. The pressure, already unbearable, would find new ways to tighten, and there was no guarantee, none at all, that refusing would save either the horse or the land in the end. It might only delay the same outcome by a few more exhausting, humiliating days. She looked past the table, past Malachi's careful, patient sorrow, toward the round pen where Sovereign stood watching, and found herself thinking, for the first time in 18 months, not about what she had failed to save, but about what was standing directly in front of her still capable of being saved, an animal that had trusted a stranger's hands in the dark when every instinct in its body told it not to, and had returned that trust 9 days later by crossing an open pasture to stand over a woman who had fallen, rather than running for the freedom the open gate had offered him. She thought of Jedediah on the porch, coffee gone cold, watching the wild herd on the ridge and saying a ranch without them nearby was just a farm with better scenery, and she understood, with a clarity that arrived less like a decision and more like something she had always known and had simply been too afraid to act on, that the version of herself capable of signing that paper had already died once, on a kitchen floor 18 months ago, and she was not required to keep living as that version any longer. She picked up the pen. She did not sign the surrender form. She used it instead to write, across the center of the page, in handwriting steadier than anyone watching expected from a woman who had not slept properly in over a week, a single line refusing consent to any transfer of the animal and requesting, formally, a delay of proceedings pending independent verification of the stallion's origin and lineage, a right she was fairly certain existed somewhere in state code, though she could not have cited the statute if her life had depended on it, and simply gambled, in that moment, on the fact that stalling was the only weapon still available to her. The committee exchanged glances. Malachi's careful sorrow flickered, just slightly, into something sharper before he smoothed it back into place. Greaves said the request would need to be reviewed before the hearing could proceed to resolution, which meant, for now, at least, nothing would be signed today. It was not a victory. It was barely a delay, but it was a door left open where a moment ago there had been none, and as the crowd began to disperse, grumbling about wasted mornings and unresolved paperwork, Marcella walked back toward the round pen on legs that felt like borrowed things, and found Sovereign waiting at the rail exactly where he always waited now, and pressed her forehead, just once, against the warm plane of his neck, and allowed herself, for the first time in 9 days, to cry. The reprieve lasted 3 days, and every hour of it cost her more than the 9 before it combined, because a delay in county process does not mean a pause in county pressure, and Malachi, sensing the ground shifting even slightly beneath a plan he had believed foolproof, moved to close the gap the only way he knew how, faster and harder. He returned to the review committee within 48 hours with a second complaint, this one alleging that Marcella's continued physical labor, hauling water by hand twice daily across rough pasture, constituted evidence of self-endangerment consistent with declining mental competency, a filing so cynical in its construction that even Greaves, reading it aloud at the gate on the 12th day, seemed to hesitate slightly before finishing the sentence, though he finished it anyway, because the form had been submitted correctly and correct forms, in the machinery Malachi had built, moved forward regardless of what anyone privately suspected about their author's motives. The new complaint triggered a mandatory psychological evaluation requirement to be conducted by a county-approved specialist before any further hearing could proceed, a specialist whose earliest available appointment happened to fall 9 days out, conveniently ensuring that whatever fragile momentum Marcella's small refusal had bought her would bleed out entirely in the waiting. She stood at the gate reading the notice with the particular hollow calm of someone who has run out of reactions large enough for what is happening to her. And it was in that stillness, oddly, that she noticed the water pump breaker box across the boundary fence for the first time in days, and noticed, too, something she had not let herself consider until now, that the old hand-crank mill behind the barn, the one Jedediah's grandfather had installed before the county grid ever reached this valley, the one that had sat rusted and unused for 30 years because it required more physical strength to operate than any one person alone could reasonably sustain, might still turn, if there were ever two of them working it instead of one. It was an absurd thought. It was also the only tool she had left that no one had thought to shut off. She spent the 13th day clearing 30 years of disuse from the old mechanism, oiling gears with kitchen oil when she had nothing else, replacing a snapped belt with braided baling twine, working until her hands bled fresh through blisters that had only just begun to callous. And when she finally tried the crank alone that evening, it moved perhaps a quarter turn before her strength gave out entirely, the mill groaning back to stillness, the water it was meant to draw remaining exactly as inaccessible as it had been before she started. She sat down in the dirt beside it, defeated in a way that felt different from every defeat before it, because this one had cost her something she could not easily rebuild, physical strength spent against a machine that simply would not move for one person alone. And it was in that particular exhaustion, head down, hands raw, that she heard the fence rail creak again behind her. Sovereign had learned, over 13 days, to test that gate whenever he sensed her distress, and this time, when the latch gave, he did not cross to stand beside her the way he had in the pasture. He walked instead, deliberate, unmistakably purposeful, to the mill itself, and lowered his head to investigate the crank arm the way he investigated everything unfamiliar, with careful, exploratory breath. Marcella watched him for a long moment before understanding arrived, and when it did, it arrived with a kind of disbelief that felt almost like laughter breaking through grief. She rose, found a length of rope and a length of harness leather still hanging, and used, in the tack room since before Jedediah's death, and worked, slow and patient, to fashion something crude enough to connect an enormous, half-wild animal's shoulder to a crank mechanism designed for human hands. It should not have worked. Wild stallions do not pull machinery. They are not broke to harness, not trained to pressure against their chest, not accustomed to the particular discipline of walking a slow circle for a purpose they cannot see the point of. But Sovereign had spent 13 days learning that this particular human's voice meant something worth trusting, and when Marcella clicked her tongue and stepped forward, murmuring the same low, unbroken register she had used in the dark on the very first night, he leaned into the harness and walked. The mill groaned, resisted, and then, for the first time in 30 years, turned. Water began moving up through the old pipe within minutes. Not much, not fast, but enough, more than enough, filling the trough beside the round pen, while Marcella stood with both hands pressed over her mouth, watching a wild horse walk slow, patient circles beside her, providing with brute animal patience what an entire county apparatus had spent 13 days trying to take away. It would become, later, the image that traveled furthest, the one that eventually reached beyond the valley entirely. A wild stallion working a hand-crank mill in gratitude beside the woman who had saved him, filmed on a shaking phone by one of the same officers who had spent nearly 2 weeks parked outside her gate. A man who, it turned out, had a daughter who loved horses and had been quietly rooting for Marcella since the third day, though he'd never once said so out loud. The footage reached the old man in the wheelchair on the 14th day, the same day his daughter finally convinced him to let her drive him into town, not toward the hearing, which had been rescheduled twice more by then, but toward the county records office, where Elias Thorne, 91 years old, retired notary and the last living person in Larkspur Hollow who had personally handled the original founding paperwork of the township, asked to see documents that had not been requested by anyone in over 60 years. He was not a man anyone expected to matter in a dispute over ranch land and wild horses. He had spent the last decade of his life mostly forgotten, tending a small garden behind a house 2 blocks from the courthouse he'd once worked inside for 40 years, and the town had grown so accustomed to his quiet absence from public life that when he wheeled himself up to the review committee's folding table on the 17th day, escorted by his daughter and carrying a leather folio thick with age, more than a few people in the gathered crowd did not recognize him at all. Greaves recognized him immediately, and something in the officer's posture changed the moment he did, a straightening that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with the particular unease of a bureaucrat realizing the ground beneath a case he'd assumed was settled had just shifted somewhere he could not yet see. Elias asked, without preamble, to see the animal in question, and when the crowd parted enough to let him wheel toward the round pen, when Sovereign lifted his head and turned to face the old man with the same wary stillness he'd shown every stranger since the day of the mill, Elias went quiet for a long moment, studying the crescent-shaped whirl above the stallion's foreleg with an intensity the crowd found difficult to interpret, until he finally spoke, his voice thinner than it once had been, but carrying, in that gravel turnout, with the particular authority of someone who has waited a very long time to say something and has stopped caring whether anyone is ready to hear it. He said the mark on that horse's chest matched, precisely, a description written into the township's founding charter in 1891, a document drafted by the valley's original settlers alongside the tribal families and free-range horsemen who had negotiated shared use of the grazing lands before statehood formalized the boundaries at all. The charter, largely forgotten, buried in county archives and never repealed because no one in living memory had ever needed to invoke it, stipulated that the leader of what the original document called the sovereign herd, a specific bloodline traced through a single unbroken maternal and marking lineage stretching back to the valley's earliest recorded free horses, was to be considered a protected symbol of the township's founding agreement, and that any property which sheltered that herd's leader in good faith, providing care rather than harm, would be granted permanent exemption from seizure, taxation dispute, or forced transfer for the duration of that stewardship. The crowd went very quiet. Elias said he had seen that exact marking only once before, 60 years earlier, on a stallion his own father had pointed out to him as a boy, the last confirmed sighting of the sovereign line before the herd scattered so thoroughly across the range that most valley residents assumed the bloodline extinct entirely. He said he had never expected to see it again in his lifetime. He said, with something that sounded, in that moment, remarkably close to wonder for a man who had spent 40 years buried in the driest possible language of legal documents, that the animal standing in that round pen was not simply a wild horse a grieving widow had taken in on impulse, but the last living heir of the exact lineage the township's founders had built their earliest promises around, and that the woman who had sheltered him, whatever the review committee wished to allege about her competency, now stood protected by a charter clause older than the county code Malachi had weaponized against her by nearly 40 years. Malachi's face, for the first time in 17 days, showed something other than careful, practiced sorrow. The committee did not close the hearing that day. Documents of that age required verification, cross-referencing with archives in the state capitol, confirmation from the Tribal Historical Office whose ancestors had co-authored the original charter, a process that would take, Greaves admitted, perhaps another week before any binding determination could be issued. But something had shifted decisively and publicly in that gravel turnout, and everyone standing there, Malachi included, understood that the ground he had built his entire plan upon had just cracked open beneath a piece of history no one, not even the county's own lawyers, had thought to check for. The week that followed the founding charter's discovery did not bring the peace anyone watching from a distance might have expected. If anything, Malachi moved faster and with less restraint, because a man who has spent nearly 2 years building toward a single outcome does not surrender that outcome quietly the moment history intervenes. He searches, instead, for whatever leverage remains before the door closes for good. He filed, on the 18th day, a formal challenge disputing the charter's continued legal standing, arguing through the Bozeman attorney's office that an 1891 township agreement, never formally codified into modern statute, held no binding force over a 21st century zoning dispute regardless of its historical authenticity, a legal argument that was, several county officials privately admitted, not entirely without merit. He simultaneously pressed the mining consortium's representatives, growing impatient after months of delay, to accelerate their own separate approach, a direct financial offer to Marcella so substantial, so far beyond anything the ranch itself could ever generate through cattle or grazing leases, that refusing it, Malachi argued to anyone who would listen, would itself constitute evidence of the very irrational, grief-addled decision-making the original welfare complaint had alleged from the start. The offer arrived by courier on the 19th day, a number written across the top of a contract thick enough to require its own folder, an amount that would clear every debt the ranch carried, fund a comfortable relocation anywhere in the country, and leave Marcella, for the first time since Jedediah's death, financially secure beyond anything her husband's careful, modest ranching had ever provided. She stood at her kitchen table that evening with the contract open in front of her, the same table where 18 months of unopened mail and unresolved grief had slowly accumulated into something like a monument to everything she had stopped facing, and she understood, reading the number twice to be sure she had not misread it, that this was the moment the entire siege had been built toward from the very beginning. Not the fines, not the fences, not even the horse, not really. All of it, every trailer parked outside her gate, every breaker switched off, every accusation of incompetence, had been pressure applied toward exactly this single signature, and the pressure had been calibrated with such precision precisely because someone who knew her finances intimately had understood, from the start, exactly how close to breaking she already was before any of it began. She thought of Jedediah's grandfather building the mill by hand. She thought of the crescent mark on Sovereign's chest, the same mark an old man had waited 60 years to see again. She thought of 900 acres that had absorbed 4 generations of a family's work, and of a brother-in-law who had left that work behind at 19 and had spent every year since measuring its worth in numbers a mining company would pay, rather than in anything the land itself had ever actually been for. She signed nothing that night either. She sat at the table until the candle she'd lit against another power outage burned down to almost nothing, and in the quiet that followed, she understood, with a certainty that felt less like a decision and more like the settling of something that had been unsettled for 18 months, exactly what she was going to do with the contract in the morning and exactly what it was going to cost her to do it. The final hearing convened on the 22nd day, moved this time from the gravel turnout to the modest county courthouse in Larkspur Hollow itself, a concession forced by the scale of attention the case had drawn once the founding charter story reached the same local animal welfare channel that had first captured the footage of the water mill, footage that had since traveled far beyond the valley, picked up by a regional news affiliate and then, within days, by outlets well beyond Montana. Entirely, drawn less by the legal complexities of township charters than by the simple, undeniable image of a wild stallion pulling water for the woman who had saved his life. The courtroom was full in a way Larkspur Hollow's modest civic spaces rarely were. Neighbors who had spent 2 weeks watching from a careful distance now packed into gallery seats alongside strangers who had driven in from 3 counties over. And Marcella sat at a table at the front of the room with a folder of her own for the first time in this entire ordeal, thin, unremarkable beside the thick stack of paperwork Malachi's attorney had assembled, containing nothing more than a single signed contract and a short, handwritten letter she had stayed up the previous night, composing and rewriting until the words finally sat right. The charter's authenticity was confirmed that morning by the State Archive Office and, more decisively, by a representative of the Tribal Historical Council who testified, briefly but with unmistakable weight, that the founding agreement had never been formally dissolved by any of the parties who had originally negotiated it, and that its protections, however dormant, remained, in the council's assessment, both historically legitimate and still owed the respect of continued honor. Malachi's attorney argued anyway, exactly as filed, that historical legitimacy did not equal modern legal force, and for a tense stretch of that morning it seemed entirely possible the judge presiding over the matter might rule the charter a moving, meaningful, but ultimately non-binding piece of local history, leaving the welfare review's underlying mechanics fully intact and Marcella's fate exactly where it had stood 3 weeks earlier. It was Marcella herself who rose, when finally given the floor, and did not speak first about the charter at all. She placed the mining consortium's contract on the table in front of the judge, the signature line still blank, and said, in a voice steadier than she expected, given how little sleep had passed through her in 3 weeks, that she was formally declining the offer, in writing, on the record, regardless of how the charter question was ultimately decided, because the land in question had never been for sale, and had not become for sale simply because someone had finally offered enough money to make refusing it look, to outside eyes, like a symptom of the very incompetence she stood accused of. She said that her husband had spent 7 years watching wild horses move across that ridge from their porch, believing the land was worth more with them nearby than without, and that whatever the county ultimately decided about an old document's binding force, she intended to keep honoring that belief with or without its protection, because it had never actually been the charter that mattered to her in the first place. It had been the choice. The gallery was silent through all of it, the particular silence of a room recognizing, without yet being told, that it was watching something decided. The judge took the charter question under brief recess and returned within the hour with a ruling that split the difference in a way that satisfied the letter of modern law while honoring the spirit of the older agreement. The founding charter, while not independently enforceable as binding statute, would be recognized as a legitimate historical easement sufficient to establish reasonable cause for dismissing the welfare complaint entirely, given the absence of any credible ongoing evidence of neglect. Once the Stallion's protected status and Marcella's demonstrated care were properly weighed and given, the judge noted directly and without any attempt to soften the observation for the benefit of the man sitting at the plaintiff's table, the unusually convenient timing, structure, and financial motive underlying the original complaint's filing. The fines were vacated. The review was closed. The stock trailer that had sat parked outside Elkhorn Creek Ranch for 22 days was driven away that same afternoon, empty, exactly as it had arrived. Malachi did not stay to hear the ruling read in full. He left the courthouse before the gallery had finished absorbing what had just happened, and Marcella, watching him go through the tall windows at the front of the room, felt something that was not triumph, not exactly, but was not far from it either, a kind of exhausted, hollowed-out relief that had no energy left over for satisfaction, only for the simple, overwhelming fact of having survived something she had, for several long nights, genuinely doubted she would. The ranch that Marcella returned to that evening did not look different from the outside. The fences still sagged in the same 3 places. The barn roof still let its thin blade of morning light fall across the same patch of hay. But something in the way she walked through the gate felt different. A weight lifted that had nothing to do with legal victories and everything to do with a decision made and held 3 separate times, against 3 separate kinds of pressure designed specifically to break it. Sovereign met her at the round pen rail the way he had every evening since the watermill. And this time, for the first time, she opened the gate fully rather than simply stepping through it, and stood at the threshold, watching him watch the open pasture beyond, the same pasture that led, eventually, all the way to the boundary fence and the public range beyond it, where a herd was still out there somewhere, moving through the sage the way it had always moved, waiting. He did not run for it immediately. He stood a long moment at the open gate, ears forward, testing the air, before he finally stepped through, slow, unhurried, and paused just outside it to turn back once, toward the woman who had spent 3 weeks nearly losing everything to keep him alive, in a gesture that asked nothing and gave nothing except the simple fact of having noticed her, before he turned again and moved off toward the ridge at an easy, heeled gait, favoring the leg only slightly now, less each day, and did not look back a second time. She let him go. That had never been in question. Not really. Not since the first night in the dark when she'd chosen to free him rather than keep him, though the county's mechanisms had spent 3 weeks pretending the two things were the same. A protected herd leader did not belong in a round pen any more than a widow belonged locked inside a grief she had not chosen either. But the charter's protection remained, regardless of where Sovereign roamed, tied not to his physical presence on her land, but to the demonstrated bond of stewardship between the ranch and the herd he led, a bond the ruling had formally recognized, and that meant, in practical terms, Elkhorn Creek Ranch was now permanently shielded from the specific kind of seizure and forced transfer Malachi had so carefully engineered, an outcome that struck Marcella, standing at the empty round pen in the fading light, as a strange and fitting kind of justice. The very ordinance meant to strip her of the land had ultimately handed her the one protection strong enough to keep it forever safe from exactly that kind of attack again. She did not see Sovereign again for 11 days after that, though she watched the ridge each evening out of a habit she made no effort to break, the same habit Jedediah had kept for 7 years before her. And when the stallion finally reappeared, it was not alone. He came at dusk, moving down from the tree line with 4 mares and a pair of yearlings trailing loosely behind him, the whole small band pausing at the boundary fence, exactly where the barbed wire had once trapped him, exactly where Marcella had once knelt in the dark with nothing but a flashlight and a voice she hadn't known she still had. He did not cross onto the property this time. He simply stood at the fence line, watching the house, watching her standing on the porch in the last of the evening light, for a long, unhurried minute, before turning back toward the open range and leading his small herd away into the blue dusk, unhurried, unafraid, exactly as a wild thing should move through country that had finally, after everything, agreed to let it be wild. Marcella stood on the porch a long while after they'd gone, coffee going cold in her hands the way it always had in her husband's, and understood, watching the empty ridge settle back into silence, that something in her had finally stopped waiting to be forgiven for a death she had never had the power to prevent, and had started, instead, simply living again, in a house that was still too large, on land that was still too quiet, but that belonged, now and permanently, to exactly the kind of stewardship her husband's family had always meant it to hold. Malachi did not return to Elkhorn Creek Ranch after that. The mining consortium withdrew its offer within the month. Once word of the charter ruling made clear that no future acquisition of the property would proceed without decades of legal entanglement, neither the consortium nor Malachi himself had any appetite left to pursue. He kept his accounting job in Bozeman. He did not attend the small gathering the town eventually held in early winter to formally reopen the Historical Society's records around the founding charter, an event Elias Thorne insisted on chairing himself, despite his age, despite everyone's gentle suggestions that he let someone else handle it, because, he said, some things a man ought to see through to the end himself if he had the years left to manage it. Odette came back around by the first frost, casserole in hand, and this time Marcella opened the door before the dish had even fully settled on the porch step, and the two women stood together in the cold for a while, saying very little, the way people do when an apology has already been made in every way except the words themselves, and both of them understand the words were never really the point. The east pasture fence got mended before winter set in fully. The barn roof did not yet, though Marcella found herself, some mornings, standing beneath that thin blade of light rather than avoiding it, letting it fall across her hands the way it used to fall across nothing at all. And most evenings, when the light went long and gold across the ridge, she still made coffee she sometimes let go cold, and still sat on the porch the way her husband once had, watching for shapes moving against the tree line, and some evenings there was nothing to see at all, just wind and sage and the long empty country stretching out toward the mountains. But some evenings, not often, not predictably, but often enough that she never stopped watching for it, a small band of horses would appear at the ridge line as the sun went down, and among them, unmistakable even at that distance, a single stallion would pause at the edge of the trees and stand there a moment, looking back toward the house, before the whole herd moved on into the dark together, wild, whole, for reasons neither the county nor the mining consortium nor even Marcella herself could have fully explained a year earlier, safe. If this story moved you tonight, you already understand why it mattered to tell it. Somewhere out there, someone is standing at their own version of that gate, carrying water by hand, refusing to sign something that was never truly theirs to give away, and they need to hear that the choice, however small it looks in the moment, is the whole story. Let us know in the comments what part of Marcella's fight stayed with you longest. Tell us your city so we know how far this reached tonight. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the vulnerable are always worth protecting, even when protecting them costs everything you thought you had left to lose.